Hi, if you're just joining us, I'm Matilda Gregg, the lead organiser for this workshop. This paper is part of a panel called Nationalism and Propaganda, which is essentially concerned with the question of agency. In other words, who has control over the story? Women warriors often make great subjects for news stories, books, or art, and workshops, because they often seem exceptional, inspirational, attention-grabbing. Over the years, many different governments have realised this and put these stories to use for strategic, diplomatic, or cultural reasons. The videos in this panel explore different examples of this in modern France, Turkey, and China, and also ask how, by contrast, the women at the centre of these stories might be able to exploit their fame for their own devices. Alison's talk in particular will interest you if you want to know more about the First World War, the Second World War, and the French Resistance, and what the rules were for being a good female war hero.
Our next speaker is Alison Fell, who is Professor of French Cultural History at the University of Leeds. She has published widely on French and British women's experiences during and after the First World War, including her most recent monograph, Women as Veterans in Britain and France After the First World War, published with Cambridge in 2018. She led a large interdisciplinary research and public engagement project during the First World War centenary at Leeds called Legacies of War, and was a co-investigator of the AHRC Gateways to the First World War Public Engagement Centre. Her new project investigates women's emotional responses to their paid labour, 1880 to 1930. The title of her paper today is French Invasion Heroines and Their Afterlives. Thank you very much.
In 1914 and 1915, in France and Belgium, a group of women was singled out as invasion heroines, plucky peasants, nuns, and postal workers who defied invading soldiers, sometimes by taking up arms, in order to preserve life or foil attempts to take their territory. But in order for these women to function as embodiments of the finer qualities of their nations, journalists consistently emphasised their so-called feminine qualities, such as self-sacrifice, frailty, piety, grace, and maternal solicitude. As Margaret Darrow notes in her book French Women in the First World War, the ideal heroine was small, young, pretty, and if possible, orphaned. If the heroine couldn't be young and little, she could be simple and above all, feminine. The central moment in most of the stories was the confrontation of the frail French woman and the brutal German officer. In tale after tale, French civilization, embodied in French femininity, cowed and conquered German brutality by its nobility, courage, and moral rectitude. The end of the quotation. It's for this reason that nursing work of some form featured in many female heroism stories. Nursing allowed women to be both close to the front lines while remaining firmly situated within traditional understandings of the feminised domestic sphere. In popular representations of invasion heroines, nurses at the front were not becoming honorary soldiers even if they did take up arms. They were extending their feminine influence, bringing the home or domestic front to the soldiers. The reason why in many popular accounts, the nurse functioned as a synecdoche for the lost or absent home. This desire to re-feminise women, and especially armed women, who were active at or near to the front, explains why French invasion and resistance heroines, including Emilienne Moreau, who's the one I'm going to discuss today, were frequently referred to as nurses in wartime and post-war accounts of their activities, even if, as in the case of Moreau, this was a fabrication. So after the war, the public perception of invasion heroines who'd survived depended largely on the extent to which their wartime activities were understood as transgressive in gender terms, while in some cases, wartime heroism for women enabled them to access public, political or cultural life in a way they might not have been able to do otherwise. In other cases, their heroic activities were less acclaimed or even denigrated in post-war societies. So to turn to my case study, Emilienne Moreau, who was known as the heroine of Loos. Now, so in 1914, Emilienne Moreau was 17. She was the daughter of a coal miner turned shopkeeper in Los-en-Goël near Lens in the Pas-de-Calais region of northern France. She helped her father in the shop while working to pass her brevet qualification in order to train to be a school teacher. When the Germans invaded, she warned advancing French troops of the positioning of the German artillery. The French troops were forced to retreat, however, and the civilian populations lived under siege conditions. In December 1914, her father died as a result, according to Moreau's later autobiography, of the privations and anguish of the occupation, having been imprisoned for breaking the curfew. The majority of the population having fled, Moreau had set herself up as a temporary teacher when the school closed. In September 1915, British troops attacked to try and retake the town. Again, Moreau warned the kilt-wearing Highlanders of the 9th Black Watch of the positioning of the German defences. During the battle for the village, Moreau helped an army doctor to care for wounded soldiers, and when attempting to move one of them to safety, she seemed to have been fired at by German soldiers. In response, she picked up a gun, probably left by one of the British RAMC members, and shot back, allegedly killing at least 2, although numbers vary between 2 and 20 in the accounts. Moreau's sister was wounded by shrapnel during the battle, and when the family took her to a hospital in Béthune, nearby, they learned too that Henri Moreau, her brother, had been killed in action earlier that year. Moreau was awarded medals by both the French and British governments. Général de Sailly commenting when awarding her the Croix de Guerre in 1917 that, quote, "You honour the women of France. For them you're a magnificent and reassuring example." Her story had all the ingredients the press were looking for, and Le Petit Parisien, a powerful French newspaper, quickly offered her 5,000 francs for an exclusive. Moreau was staggered by the amount. This is what she says in her autobiography, quote, "We were living in a precarious financial situation with a military allowance of 3.5 francs a day and 1.5 to help with the children." So the newspaper put her and her mother up in a luxurious chateau near Versailles, bought her new clothes, got her photograph taken, and serialised her memoirs of 1914 and 1915. Her photograph was then widely distributed to French soldiers, and her portrait was added to an enormous commemorative painting called the Panthéon de la Guerre, the Pantheon of the War, to its large staircase of heroes. She was also the subject of an Australian propaganda film called The Joan of Arc of Loos, directed by George Willoughby, that was used for recruitment in Australia. So there was a veritable publicity machine promoting her image as an armed heroine, and she was also used by the state for fundraising and as a symbol of Franco-British entente. So this is, again, an extract from her memoirs, Remembering the Time. She said, "We weren't in the chateau for pleasure. I had to work. Every day I'd fill the pages of a notebook that one of the newspaper's editors would come and pick up. My mother and I weren't permitted to leave the chateau as I'd become an exclusive for Le Petit Parisien, and it wasn't willing to share me with its competitors. Later, the newspaper printed enormous posters of one of my photos, which decorated the walls of the Parisian metro, and then the walls of every town in France. As money was needed to help care for the wounded, it had been decided to appeal to the well-known faces of the war. Our role was to collect money from wherever it could be found, that is to say, from the rich. So they made me a pretty dress. I had a black one because I was wearing mourning for my father and brother, and I was sent to high society social occasions." So there are several factors that help explain why Moreau was turned into this war heroine. 1914 and 1915 were very costly for the Allies on the Western Front in terms of losses of both territory and casualty rates. The Battle of Loos, for example, saw the 9th Battalion of the Black Watch suffer 700 casualties. It wasn't easy for journalists to find inspiring and morale-boosting tales of heroism amid such losses. For the French, Emilienne Moreau, poignantly young in her mourning clothes, simultaneously represented stoicism in relation to the heavy losses of life and territory, and the bravery, resistance, and sacrifices made by patriotic civilians. She also represented Allied cooperation under fire. In addition, any young woman fighting for her country against apparently hopeless odds raised the ever-present spectre of Joan of Arc, the ultimate French armed heroine who played a really important role in First World War propaganda. So Moreau's gender was a vital factor in the communication of the different levels of meaning with which her image was charged. While journalists and popular writers focused on quasi-military qualities of courage and coolness under fire, her underlying feminine vulnerability and maternal instincts were equally emphasised. Writers were swift to justify, moreover, her taking up of arms as a defence of the innocent in the face of a supposedly barbaric enemy who preyed on civilians or wounded soldiers. So I'm going to just read two examples, one British and one French, to give you an idea of the way in which she was represented. So this is a popular published account of the war by a Scottish journalist, Donald Mackenzie. She seemed a born nurse, and her gentle words and sweet smile were like a tonic to the stricken soldiers. Through a shattered window in Emilienne's home, she'd seen a German soldier bayoneting a wounded Highlander in the street. "They're killing the wounded," she cried. Emilienne remained fearless and composed. For her own safety, she took no thought. Her sole concern was for the wounded men under her care. And the second example is from a French journal, L'Illustration, one of the most popular newspapers in the First World War. There was blood everywhere. At her feet, the wounded were moaning. She could see from their striking outfits that they were the famous Highlanders that the Germans so feared. One by one, she picked them up. She wasn't strong, but her will fortified her muscles. She helped some to have a drink and bandaged others. She put them to bed as best she could, and the English surgeons found her leaning over the brave men, many of whose lives she'd saved. At the entrance of the village, a song could be heard, sung out by thousands of lungs. It was God Save the King. Mademoiselle Moreau waited. When the national anthem was finished, she sang the Marseillaise at the top of her voice. So these two accounts show differences between French and British responses to Moreau as a young female war heroine. In the Scottish narrative, the British narrative, a traditional version of femininity was foregrounded, featuring her as a self-abnegating nurse in the face of German barbarity. Whereas in the French example, it's her patriotism that takes centre stage, endowing her with superhuman strength and willpower, and suggesting that both mobilised and civilian French citizens were admirable friends in arms to Britain in the Allied defence of French territory. But the contradictions apparent in the construction of a heroine who combined, on the one hand, an innocent civilian war victim, and on the other, a brave, patriotic she-soldier, weren't lost on the German press. The German magazine Des Deutschen Volkskriegstagebuch reproduced the French press photographs of Moreau with the caption, quote, "the so-called heroine of Loos, who's being celebrated in the English and French press because she murdered 5 German soldiers in the Battle of Loos." And they placed it strategically next to an article stressing the German nation's ongoing desire for peace. So just as Edith Cavell's guilt was emphasised by the German press when she was executed in 1915, Moreau was presented in the German example as a franc-tireur, breaking the rules of warfare, murdering soldiers, rather than as a brave defender of humanity in the face of barbarism. When she wrote about her experiences many years later, Moreau distanced herself as an adult narrator from her former self, whom she presented as a naive young girl, and she emphasised a lack of agency, not only in her acts under fire, but also in her construction as a public persona by the French and British media. So this is another quote from her autobiography. "I lived at that time in a kind of whirlwind. Imagine a young girl from the Pas-de-Calais, having always lived quietly in a peaceful little village, suddenly exposed to everyone's gaze, received and congratulated by bemedalled officials wearing cocked hats in public squares and golden salons. Think too that for hours, for whole days, I had to curtsy, smile, answer questions, thank people, make speeches, and congratulate other combatants who were just as intimidated as I was. So the young girl improvised, tried always to remain calm and simple, opened her eyes and ears in order to learn from the behaviour of others in such a new world. Slowly, I got used to my role, for I had a role to play. I didn't think of them for a minute of fleeing because I knew that my example served to raise soldiers' morale." So although she presents her past self as overwhelmed by her sudden celebrity, in her later life, it's clear that Moreau made use of her prestigious status for both personal and political reasons. Her heroism continued to be celebrated in the interwar years. So, for example, in a 1928 play, she appeared as a character who was designed to give young French Catholic girls role models to follow in later life. But her life had also been transformed in material ways from her war experiences. So it boosted her economic as well as her cultural capital. She explains that the money that they'd earned from the newspaper not only allowed them to survive, it paid for her lessons in an institution in Paris, which allowed her to pass her qualifications and become a teacher. In addition to the financial gains that brought about a degree of social mobility for Moreau, the residence of her First World War role came particularly into play when the Second World War broke out. Although she'd settled into civilian life after 1918, she seems to have been more than willing to take up her role again once the circumstances changed. So a newspaper report in March 1940 has her attending a football match between British soldiers and a local team from Lens as a guest of honour, quote, proudly wearing the French and British decorations conferred on her during the last war, and thus revivifying her role as a symbol of Franco-British entente. She'd married a socialist activist, Juste Evrard, in 1932, and like lots of socialists, the whole family became involved in the French resistance in the Second World War. She related in her autobiography that when her house was searched by German soldiers in 1942, they demanded to see her First World War medals. And when she produced them, quote, the officer examined them in a serious manner and then shouted an order to his soldiers, present arms. I would have willingly gone without this kind of display, but it was, after all, a fine gesture. So she uses her past quasi-military status in order to elevate herself above other civilians, implying that the German soldiers treated her with respect because they'd sort of recognised her as a war heroine, which may have saved her from arrest. Her husband was arrested and imprisoned in 1941. She went on to make further use of her First World War role to help her in her quest to make political gains for the Second World War resistance movement. In particular, she hoped that her status would add weight to her role as a representative of one of the networks when she escaped to England in 1944 to seek support from the British government. And in preparation for this, she'd already been to a French police station to get a document for, certifying the validity of her First World War medals. In 1944, an article in the Times reported her arrival in England, overtly linking her First and Second World War roles and adding authenticity and authority to her testimony of conditions in occupied France. So the article reminded readers that, quote, during the Battle of Loos in September 1915, Madame Moreau saved the lives of many English soldiers. She's now a delegate of the resistance movement to the French Collective Assembly. It quotes her saying, quote, the Germans are no different now from what they were in 1914, and reporting that they'd carried out summary executions of members of the resistance movement as they'd executed civilians during the invasion. More generally, her autobiographical descriptions of the occupation openly recall her First World War experiences, and she adopts the same persona of instinctively patriotic, simple, adaptable, and selfless heroine. So she maintained and to some extent exploited her notoriety in her later life. Her entry into political life was aided not only by her marriage to a well-networked socialist leader, but equally by her ability to draw on her status as First and Second World War resistance heroine. She became General Secretary of the Women's Section of the Socialist Party in the Pas-de-Calais region in 1934, and was one of only 6 women who made a Compagnon de la Libération in 1945, and was a member of the steering committee of the Socialist Party from 1945 to 1963, as well as being president of a very powerful regional veterans association. In France, women's resistance activities in the First World War were overshadowed by the much higher profile of Second World War resistance. And in the 60s and 70s, when she published her family memoir, it was proof of resistance heroism in the Second World War that was an entry ticket into public acclaim and political power. So it's unsurprising that the cover of her autobiography describes her as Émilienne Moreau, Compagnon de la Libération, and features a photograph of her meeting Général de Gaulle. But it also features the famous First World War photograph of her as a 17-year-old wearing mourning clothes that the Petit Parisien had distributed, suggesting that her contribution as a Second World War resistant hadn't completely effaced her previous identity. So she's a really interesting case study because for many French people, she remained a living symbol of resistance in relation to both world wars. Unlike for some of the British, Russian, Serbian women who also had armed roles during the First World War, and who many of whom found post-war life very difficult and were ridiculed or rejected. The high status of resistance and resistance heroines in France meant that Moreau was able to accrue cultural capital in the later decades of the 20th century, and also to have a successful political career in an era where this was very rare indeed for women of her kind of working class background. Thank you.
Thanks so much for watching this talk, which was part of the Nationalism and Propaganda panel. If you haven't already, make sure to go check out the other 2 talks in this panel by clicking the links on screen now.